everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Superintendent's Budget Advisory Task Force. We may have some members joining us as we continue to progress in our meeting today, but we want to start on time, hoping to end on time. And for today's meeting of the Superintendent's Budget Advisory Task Force, as we do with most meetings, we'll quickly just review the norms, our goals. Our goals are to develop an understanding of the district's budget and financial issues, to recommend to the board through the superintendent ideas related to reducing expenditures or increasing revenues towards a more balanced and focused budget, contribute to improved communication through committee, staff, community, students, and parents to enhance understanding of the district's budget and financial condition, and contribute to and support a transparent and collaborative budget process. So, looking at those, we will move into our work, also taking a look at our purpose and our goals. And we just reviewed the goals, the focus areas, deeper understanding of budget and deficit or surplus, provide voice in budget to support what works for school-based personnel, support students' needs, compare FUSD to other districts and what we're doing well, seek solutions, bring innovative thoughts, provide parents' voice in seeking more transparent communication to parents, review non-personnel items first, gain common agreement where there is flexibility in the budget, and continue to improve the allocation of funds. So moving forward, our agenda today includes a review of our second interim. And our Associate Superintendent, Ms. Nancy Pfeiffer, is unable to be with us today. So our Director of Budget, Audit, and Attendance, Mr. James Arcala, is going to be reviewing our second interim. And our second interim, as an overview, is our second formal progress report of the year. For those of you very familiar with the process, we adopt our budget in June. We then put forward a first interim, which is our first progress report based on the adopted budget. And then we have our second interim. Second interim, which James may review as well, includes a certain level of assumptions. And it's a point in the year where we look for information from a group of county office business officials across the state. They come together and they set the criteria in which districts should use assumptions for their second interim. They do the same thing with the first interim. In this example, we've had the governor's budget proposal in January, which encompassed a lot of information and some new ideas on how to fund different aspects of the state's budget. It also included some positive news related to the cost of living adjustments. So in those two areas specifically, the county office CBOs that have put together the guidance for school districts have advised that we use the updated COLA projections from the governor's January budget proposal, but that we don't count on all of the flexibilities granted to districts through the revised ADA accounting. And we, I think, talked about that previously in our last meeting, which is currently we're permitted to take the higher of the last 2 years for our average daily attendance, our ADA. The governor's proposal in January has outlined that if approved, districts can take a 3-year rolling average of the enrollment. For districts like Fremont and almost every other district in the state, that provides a much better fiscal condition because of declining enrollment. And so we are not making that assumption in our second interim as an assumptive point, because we've been advised not to. However, we continue to hear at the state level that it's very likely this revision will come to fruition. We have seen legislation introduced that outlines an exciting new proposal, which at least in my opinion, it's exciting, which is enrollment-based funding. And we've talked about that in this task force before, meaning that districts would be funded based on their total enrollment, not their total ADA. And while Fremont has a very high percentage of ADA, even the difference between being funded at 100% of our enrollment versus, let's say, 97% of our ADA is a significant increase in funding. However, those two things kind of going through the pipeline together at the state level What we're hearing anecdotally is we expect the governor's proposal to be the one that carries the day when we get to budget adoption. But remember, as we look at second interim, we're looking at the improved COLAs, but not the restructured ADA amounts. So with that, Mr. Arcala, I will turn it to you. We'll go through the budget presentation. I've advised our Director of Budget, Accounting, and Attendance that he can provide an overview. This has been presented publicly to our board, so we won't go into the single greatest detail of every slide, but we'll also open it up for more discussion afterwards. And thinking forward after this point, the next step in the process is for us to go to the May revise, which by all accounts still sounds like it's going to be improved news. So looking forward to hearing that information at the state level. James, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Sure. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, CJ. So I'll just go over the second interim, similar to what we did at the board meeting, just to kind of refresh everybody's memory. So ultimately, just to give a quick overview, like CJ was talking about, this slide covers kind of the ed code in relation to second interim. So just to focus in here, the second interim report covers the period ending January 31st. And we just need to make sure that we get this presented and approved no later than 45 days after the close of the period being reported. So that's what this slide was mainly for. And then the way that we had the presentation set up is we first were going to start with the general fund. And so with the general fund, we're going to discuss kind of like a drilling down aspect. We're going to start at a very high level and then kind of work our way down. And then I'll go ahead and talk about the multi-year projections, other funds, and then CJ discuss the negotiation aspects of our presentation. So when it came to the general fund, you could stay right here. I'll just stop to talk about the general fund real quickly. So this piece of the general fund, we mainly want to focus in on column D, which was the second interim budget column. And we wanted to kind of show everyone the difference between second interim versus first interim. So it's column D versus column C. So in column E, it shows the variance. So it would be column D, second interim, minus column C, first interim, and E would be the variance. So we really wanted to focus in here on the differences. And so with revenues, we saw revenues increase by 11.5 million, expenditures increased by 2.9 million. And then we saw the surplus, and this is what we focused in at the board meeting, is it increased by $8.7 million. And you see deficit spending decreased by $8.7 million between first interim and second interim. And obviously that led to an increase to the fund balance by $8.7 million. And in the end, our reserves was left with $54 million in regards to the dollar aspect, but 12.33% when it came to breaking that down as a percentage. So we really honed in on that $8.7 million. And that focus right there is the $8.7 million really had to do with like one-time categorical funding that came down the pike and an increase to special ed funding. So the main aspect with special ed, at first interim, we projected our revenue for special ed. And thankfully at the second interim, the funding for special ed actually came in higher. So then there was some increase in revenue there. And then the other aspect was some categorical funding, which was the main aspect was the educator effectiveness grant. And so that came in, and we budgeted the revenue at second interim, but we did not budget the expenditures. So that revenue amount fell into the fund balance. And the reason why we didn't budget the expenditures was mainly because we're not implementing the educator effectiveness grant or that program until next year, until 22-23. So that helps explain what that $8.7 million entails. You could go to the next slide, please. And so this aspect, we wanted to just drill down a little bit more and breaking it down between the general fund, unrestricted, and restricted general fund. And what we really wanted to show here was the contributions, and that's something that's just an ongoing thing is that we do have contributions from the unrestricted side into the restricted side of the house. So we have $62.4 million in contributions from unrestricted to help support the restricted general fund programs. And we have a note there. The contributions are mainly for special ed, routine restricted maintenance, and a very small aspect is counter-vocal programs, but the main thing is special ed. So just something to always keep in back of your mind that special education, it's not a self-sustaining program. We do need funds from the unrestricted side to help support the special education program. And it's something across all districts where it is an impact to all districts across California, where the state just doesn't give enough funds for special ed, and we need to make contributions to support our special education students. So we just wanted to highlight that with this slide. So you can go on to the next one, please. So drilling down even further, we wanted to hone in on the revenue aspects. So the revenue increased from $11.5 million. So, the question is why? And here we have the answers. We have the LCFF, or local control funding formula, increased very small amounts, around $70,000. And that was mainly due to supplemental grants. So you have your unduplicated pupils, your English learners, your foster youth, and your low-income students. We have a slight increase in that population within Fremont. And so we got an additional bump for the supplemental grant that supports those students. And then we have the federal revenue, like I just discussed earlier, that's mainly from the special education revenue. So more special education funds we received through the federal revenues. And then state revenues, we have some categorical programs that came in, the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program, which we did budget the revenue and expenditures. And then the 7.2 million is from the Educator Effectiveness Grant, like I discussed before. We budgeted the revenues, but not expenditures because we're not implementing it until next year. And then we got $600,000 in additional special education revenue. So that was great from the state revenue side. And then the local revenue, we did see some local grants and donations increase by roughly 200,000. However, we project that our lease rentals will decrease by $500,000 based on projections that we currently have in regards to revenue currently coming into the district. So we had to reduce that by $500,000. And then next slide, please. And then we have the expenditures here. So mainly the salaries and benefits. We decreased the salaries and benefits to align with reality, to align with what we currently have in regards to our current state of salaries and benefits, of who's employed and where they kind of came in at in regards to their salary and their benefits. So we saw some savings there. So we decreased expenditures in certificated, classified, and benefits. And then we're going down to the capital outlay and other expenditures. So we had an $80,000 decrease there, but it's mainly due to transfers between expenditures. The budget is a live living document and it's constantly moving and changing depending on the needs of the district. So there were some transfers from there, from capital outlay and other expenditures to other needs. And then we have books and supplies. So that was a major increase there, $6.2 million. And that mainly has to do with number one, a textbook adoption, the program's called Math Expressions, and then also budgeting that ELOP program that I discussed earlier on the revenue side. So we're budgeting that mainly in books and supplies, but we're also budgeting it under services and other expenses, such as like contracts and things of that nature. So the ELOP is budgeted there as well. And there has been some transfers between expenditures that impacted that source of expenditures. Next slide, please. And let's see. And then now, so that was the general fund. So now I'm just going to focus in, kind of turning into a new chapter. So the new chapter that we're turning the page on is the multi-year budget projections. So this is going to focus in on 22-23 fiscal year and the 23-24 fiscal year. So now we're kind of changing gears here and we're focusing in on the MYP, or multi-year projections. And these are the assumptions for 22-23 and 23-24. So for the MYP, our projections for the local control funding formula, or LCFF. So enrollment is projected at 33,174 and 32,772 for those years respectively. ADA is at 32,142 and 32,103 for those years respectively. And then unduplicated pupils, it is the 3-year rolling average is at 26.85% and 27.18%. And just like CJ was talking about earlier, we did bake in the COLA, the increase in COLA for these out years. So COLA is projected at 5.33% for 22-23 and 3.61% for 23-24. So we went ahead and included that for the LCFF. And then now we have our federal revenues here. And so for the federal revenues for the out years, we have the MAW program, or the Medical Cal Administrative Activities. That's not included. Special education federal revenue is projected with no increase as well, and one-time fundings are not budgeted. So we keep that federal revenue projections at a very conservative projected amount. And then we have state revenues. The mandated block grant is budgeted at about $1.4 million. Lottery funds are at $228 per ADA, and special ed funding is projected with COLA based on the governor's budget proposal at 5.33% and 3.61% for the out years. And then we have our local revenues. So major one is the parcel tax, measure I, is estimated at 4.4 million, and that is expiring in June 2025. And we also budgeted some other local donations, and that's going to remain the same. So we're just going to keep that flat for the out years. Next slide, please. And so here are some budget projection assumptions in regards to expenditures. So for staffing, we have the new school, Lila Brinkhurst Elementary in 22-23. It's going to cost $1.1 million for 5.0 site staff and 6 teachers. And then we have Thornton, Centerville, Hopkins. That's going to be converted to a middle school in 23-24. It's going to cost $1.2 million for 4.3 FTE each. And then we have some textbook adoptions that will be occurring in the out years in 22-23, 23-24 at 2.5 million and 3.5 million respectively. And we did make some budget adjustments in regards to declining enrollment projections, and that will be reducing, we'll have a reduction of 34 and 24 FTE teachers in 22-23 and 23-24, and that is equal to $3.4 million in 22-23 and $2.4 million in 23-24 in terms of reductions for those years due to the reduction of staff due to declining enrollment. And then we have the implementation of the TK, or transitional kindergarten. So we will be increasing 10 FTE teachers and 28 FTE paraprofessionals, which will cost $2.3 million in 22-23 for the TK program. And then we'll be increasing 10 FTE teachers and 10 FTE paraprofessionals, and that'll cost $1.5 million in 23-24 for the TK program as well. Next slide, please. And so with salary and benefits, we did include step and column increases, and that's going to be projected at an average of 1.5% each year. So here we do see the changes in STRS and PERS. Also for pension contribution rates. So we do receive these rates from our School Services of California group, and they let us know what the projections will be out for the out years. So we included that and baked that into our multi-year projections as well. Next slide, please. And so with supply services, capital outlay, and other outgo, we're going to have a transfer of funds to Mission Valley ROP. And that's projected the same level as the current year at $4.1 million that goes out to ROP. And then the general fund contribution to special ed is projected at $51.4 million and $51.8 million respectively. And like I discussed before, it's just a contribution that we do make on a yearly basis to the special ed program. And so This is a summary of the NYP budget, just looking at it from the second interim at 21-22, and then the out years 22-23 and 23-24, and just showing the change in revenue, change in expenditures. And if you go all the way to the bottom, we see that we are projecting reserves to increase in the out years from 12.33% to 13% to 14% in the out years. And this is this is without negotiations being finalized. So that will make an impact on our NYP budget and our reserves. Next slide. And similar to what we did, CJ, if you could lend me a hand, if you could discuss the negotiations aspect of what we discussed at the board meeting.
Absolutely, James. Thank you. So what you see on the screen in front of you is it's important to note a few things. One is the district's proposal has been, sorry, I'm going to add a few audience members here that are joining the call. So as we did in the second interim presentation, we looked at the district's current proposal for salary. We recognize that the district's proposal, which has been posted previously, as we've updated negotiations, is contingent on at least the flexibility that we talked about in the beginning of this meeting, with the governor providing that flexibility for ADA changes. So given that consideration, this is the district's current proposal. We're in ongoing negotiations with FUTA, and it's important to recognize that FUTA, similar to FSMA, SEIU, CSEA, all of our school employees, there is unequivocally not enough money to provide everybody the raise that they rightfully deserve. And I believe that to be true for all education professionals throughout the state, throughout the Bay Area, but most specifically in Fremont. So you can see the information provided in front of you is the current offer, and you can move to the next slide, please, Patty. And what we've outlined is our best guess. And this is, to be clear, our best estimate, because as I mentioned in the beginning, we weren't permitted to use the governor's ADA flexibility in our second interim. And so when we do that and we take a look very closely at what happens with the proposal, you can see here that without that ADA flexibility, the current offer we have with FUTA is, and I want to restate that it's just an offer, it's not an agreement, that the offer is for 3 years, but without that ADA flexibility provided by the governor, it falls back to a 1-year proposal. And when you take a look at that 1-year proposal, because our second interim does not incorporate the ADA flexibility, you can see what happens on this slide to our bottom line reserves. The 21-22 reserve falls to 7.7. The 22-23 projected reserve is 8.3. And the projected reserve for 23-24 is 9.94. And again, that is looking at a 1-year proposal, the first year of the current 3-year offer, because without the state's flexibility for ADA, that's where the current offer would revert to. You can go to slide 14, please, Patty. Now, this is a little bit different because this is where we do take into account, which we didn't do in the second interim as a general report, but we wanted to give some context to what happens if we put forward the 3-year proposal as it's currently offered, based on the ADA flexibility and the information that we know right now in our best projections. Obviously, without the state's budget being approved in June, without knowing the May revise, things are subject to change. But just taking a look at what we have right now as some assumptions, if we put the 3-year proposal that's out there now into effect, the 21-22 reserve goes to 7.4. The projected reserve for 22-23 goes to 6.2. And the projected budget for 23-24 goes to 3.3. Now, I want to call out that this is not specific to just FUTA. This is when taking into account the offer that's proposed being applied to all employee groups in Fremont Unified School District. And in fairness to FUTA, their obligation is not to negotiate for all of the employee groups in Fremont. Each representative group has that obligation. But when we look at the total cost impact of a proposal, hopefully members of the task force can understand that we would want to know those considerations for what happens with Me Too clauses and if the same offer were applied across all groups. So that's what these 3 slides are intended to show. Again, I think it's most important to highlight that we see a number of challenges. We've talked very clearly in communications and in the boardroom that the cost of inflation is skyrocketing. We know what's happening with the cost of electricity, the cost of gas, the cost of goods and services. We know what that means for our employees as a whole and as individuals, in the same way that it has an impact on the district as a whole. Because when the cost of gas goes up, the district's cost of gas goes up. When the cost of electricity goes up, the district's costs go up. So pretty much everything we buy as a good and service for our personal lives, whether it's property insurance, gas, food, a school district is paying for those similar things. And the state provides one basic ongoing increased revenue source, which is COLA. And it's a challenge to provide everything that we need for all employees across the state of California that deserve much more than the state can provide, while also accounting for the increased costs of operating the district. So with that, we'll continue with the second interim as we did, and I will turn it back to James. Thank you, James.
Thank you, CJ. Yeah, CJ is way more eloquent when it comes to that than me. So thank you again. So this slide is the designations for ending fund balance. So just to kind of give you an idea of kind of how the ending fund balance is split up, there are non-spendable amounts, $500,000, and then we have a restricted dollar. So in our restricted side of the house, we have the general fund, and it's split between unrestricted and restricted. Anything that falls into the restricted ending fund balance, that is a specific designation in our ending fund balance, and that's about $10.9 million there. So when it comes to our reserves, I know this was a question at the board meeting, our reserves for economic uncertainty, that is all unrestricted dollars. Any restricted amounts that fall into ending fund balance is in this designation of $10.9 million. And we also have another reserve that we keep there for any variances if we're off in our projections when we're closing the books. So we have a reserve variance of 1%, about $4.4 million is set aside there. We have some set aside for public employee, medical, and hospital at $3 million. Some medical administrative activities at $485,000, and the GASB, which is related to accounting requirements for fair market value. We set aside $574,000 there. And then the mandated cost, site allocations, and advanced placement. That's a small amount, about $9,000 that's set aside there. So all in all, we have about $20,000 in our assigned portion of the ending fund balance. Next slide, please. And so just to discuss the other funds. So we have other funds outside of the general fund, and we just wanted to give everyone a snapshot of where those are at. None of the funds are negative. All of them are balanced. So just to let you know, all of them are in a good situation for each of the funds that we have here. So that was kind of the main point. We wanted to show that all the funds are balanced and none of them are running into the negative. And then next slide, please. And lastly, we just wanted to give you all next steps. So the next presentation that you should see is in regards to the audit. So we should have the 2021 audit hopefully available for the next upcoming board meeting. So that should be something to look forward to. And then similar to what CJ was discussing, where they may revise. So we'll hear more about what the governor has planned and if that's going through legislation and being approved. And we'll know definitely by June when we have the adopted budget for 22-23. And that's it. So if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, James. Before we open it for questions, I'll just add a little bit of what I'm hearing and seeing, and some of you are following this very closely, so you may be hearing and seeing the same thing. We do continue to see reports out of the Legislative Analyst Office that revenues are ahead of projections at the state level. We have seen that we may actually see an increase in the COLA for next year above what's projected right now, but that hasn't come to fruition yet. We're hoping we generally will get that information at the May revise, and we are hoping that that's the case, that I believe the current projected COLA is 5.33. And we believe that it is possible that that will go up a little bit again. Obviously, that's something that we want to see. We do talk regularly on our task force about advocacy. I will tell you, I'm signed up for our advocacy work with AXA on the 3rd and 4th, I think are the dates. It's an upcoming Monday and Tuesday of April, where I will be advocating at the state level. And there are a number of assembly members and senators from the state that are talking about increasing the base. And that's ultimately what we want to continue to see, is that base level funding increase, so that everything then increases off of that. We'll continue to do that advocacy and see what we get. And we'll keep our fingers crossed, right? We are following that interest rates are going up, and we'll have to see what effect that has on the economy. It's an interesting time in global politics and statewide politics as well. So we're hoping the good news continues. With that, I'll open it up for questions, comments about either the second interim or what's coming up next in our financial planning, or where you think we should be focusing our financial efforts. We'll start with Trustee Jones.
Yeah, is it possible to go back to the presentation and pull up slide 14?
I'm not answering because I'm certain that our staff is already.
I know I'm
that.
being a pain right here. Okay, so I know I mentioned this at the board meeting, but since we fully expect this ADA, this rolling ADA, to be adopted, and we can't regressively bargain, this is what we're really projecting for where we will be, correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yes, based on our current knowledge and our current projections, this is what we project.
Okay, and when does our parcel tax expire?
I believe our parcel tax expires 2025.
Okay, so after this, so if we end 23-24 with a 3.33 reserve, then we have the 24-25 year where we would still be seeing the parcel tax, or would we not see it in that following year?
I believe if the expiration is in 25, we would see it for at least part of the 24-25 year.
Okay, so
we'll have to come back with definitive information on when we start to see that revenue stop completely.
Okay, so potentially, though, partly in that next out year, we will see a reduction in parcel tax if we don't pass another one. And then definitely by the second year out. And I know I'm projecting forward, but here's the concern that I have is when I look at our parcel tax revenue, it's somewhere like 5.8 million. And so if we don't pass another parcel tax and we have to absorb the parcel tax loss, and 5.8 million is greater than 1%, right? That's because 1% is around 4.4 million. Is that right? Something in there. I'm concerned that at some point with our reserve this low and the potential loss of the parcel tax, we're basically building into this cuts. And I know it's so hard to project that far out, but because we have to submit a 3-year budget, my brain goes there. And so I just want folks to be mindful that as we spend the reserve down, coming down this low at a time period when we may lose the parcel tax revenue, that's to me precarious, and I think it's just something that I want us to be mindful of. And when we go back to the assumptions and we have built in that reserve variance, I think the initial idea with that was, in the last couple of years, we know we've been in declining enrollment, but our actual decline has been steeper than even what we projected. And that reserve variance helps us to absorb that. That reserve variance could potentially help us to absorb, I don't know, I'm feeling like when we get down to 3.3, I've been on the board when we were at 2%, when we were at 3%, and that was scary. And the prospect of mid-year cuts, and it makes me a little nervous to see our reserves that low. And I know we have built in some things to care for that, but I just want to point out that that's getting close to like territory that I don't like to be in.
Yeah, I think Trustee Jones, I think that's a good point. And I think that we have to monitor that very closely, right? There's a few things that will happen as we come through the remainder of the budget season, depending on what does or doesn't happen with the state budget, or how we are able to move forward with our collective bargaining with all of our bargaining units. But when we bring forward our budget in June, we will have a budget for 22, 23, 23, 24, and 24, 25 will be a part of that. So we'll start to see that impact. We also recognize that where we are from a perspective in terms of what has been offered for negotiations is a multi-year settlement. And if that does happen, that does set some a little bit of more known commodity over a 3-year period, right? So that is something. And the other thing that we recognize is these are subject to change. We saw a greater increase in our enrollment decline than we wanted. That may be something that we're able to offset next year as families return to Fremont Unified, as we move into different phases of the pandemic. We may be able to offset that a little bit with our universal TK options. And in the out years, if we make a decision to move toward a full day kindergarten model, that may also have an impact on our enrollment. And so we'll have to monitor and see what happens year over year with those. But certainly you're looking out at the third year is something we definitely want to keep our eye on, and the potential impact of the parcel tax expiring, and how we may want to consider at a future time an extension of the parcel tax pending the support of our community. We've been, I think, lucky in Fremont overall when you comparatively analyze our tax rate for Fremont Unified School District bonds and parcel taxes relative to all of the other districts in Alameda and Contra Costa County. I think Fremont remains one of the lowest, and we're grateful for the community support that we do have. And hopefully in the out years, we can earn that community support again, because it is an important part of what we do, and definitely want to keep our eye on those projections moving forward. Any other questions about second interim, about projections, things we're hearing at the state level, things we're not hearing at the state level? Anything other people might be hearing at the state level or reading in headlines? The headlines are fantastic right now because everything says more money, more money, more money. And then we look at our second interim, and I think people who are really in the know start to understand how more money is an exceptional benefit, but more money isn't always enough money. And that's just kind of the fundamental challenge of the way our education system is funded in California. So we'll continue to advocate. As I mentioned, we have advocacy happening from, I think CSBA already did some of their state level advocacy. I know CTA, SEIU, and CSEA are regularly advocating. I'm not sure if they have set weeks, but I imagine they do. And then we have some groups pushing forward to DC, including CSBA and representatives of Fremont Unified. And that's such an important consideration because we'll be headed to DC to advocate for increased funding. And you think about, James, the number was $51 million as a contribution from our general education fund to special education. And I'm sure there's universal agreement that our special education students absolutely deserve all of those programs and all of that money that helps build the successful programs they deserve. But if IDEA was funded federally even close to where it's supposed to be funded, that contribution could decrease significantly. Remember that IDEA should be funded around 40%. My career has shown nothing above around 15 to 18%. So just imagine if we got to 30% and doubled that, what that might mean for our local funds. We might actually have this mythical local control of funding. But we'll see. Anything else for the group? Not everybody at once. Stay in an orderly fashion. Trustee Jones.
Sorry, I don't see any other hands, so I might as well ask. I know, and Trustee Sweeney has brought this up at meetings before, how at one point we had been told forever that the increasing costs of STRS and PERS would level out and then it would become flat for us over time. And we're seeing that isn't the case. And as I look at, I know I've spent way too much time with this thing over the weekend. It's not good for maybe my psyche, but I did. On page 28 and 29 of it, as we look at the impact of our costs, the percentage of our employee benefits, and I got out 5 years worth of unaudited actual books too, because I wanted to torture myself this weekend. And I was looking at those trends and the percentage that go, and we want to pay our employees their statutory benefits, and we don't have a choice anyway, but that's something that we want to do for our employees. But the structure of the way STRS and PERS has changed. We went from like 12% of our budget going to those things to like 20% of our budget going to those things. And that is tough to absorb. And I don't know if we're hearing anything about that, like really leveling out and stopping for us. Are we going to continue to see STRS and PERS grow?
I think that's a great question. I have not heard anything about that definitively. So here's where I view things in recent times. Yes, we were at about 8.25% for the district and the employees back in 13, 14 maybe. And it continued to just escalate. And for those who may be watching, those rates for STRS are set by the legislature at the state level. For PERS, it's set by a board of half appointed and half elected individuals. So the district has no say over those rates. And I think what is happening to districts across the state is they're still trying to catch up with that impact, because we're up in the 20% range now from the 8.25%. And we didn't get a separate pile of money to make us whole for shouldering the burden of that. And to make matters worse, our employees went from 8.25% up to 10.25% to 10.5%, sometimes 11 in some cases, which means while they're contributing more to the retirement program, which we all benefit from, and when I say employees, it's myself included, everyone who works for a public school district, that also means you take less home each month. So there's kind of a double whammy there. What we have seen in prior budgets, I would say the last 2 to 4 years, maybe, we've seen one-time funds used to temporarily buy down or freeze the rates, which has given the districts a little bit of help, but the temporary buy down isn't a long-term solution, in that if the rate was expected to, let's say, go up to 18%, they may have utilized one-time funds to hold it at 16% for another year, but it's still going to hit 18. So it's a little bit of a buffer, but it's not a solution. We have not seen in the governor's proposal this year any relief on the STRS and PERS rates. It's possible that the rates themselves may come down by the groups. I think Cal PERS may have held theirs or stopped their increase a little bit, but I would have to go back and double check that. In terms of them leveling off, I would say based on the current information, we do have a point at which they're supposed to stop, but that's all dependent on what happens in the future, right? I think we never would have imagined back in 2010 and 11 that we'd be at 26% for PERS or STIRS, right? We thought we'd stay at 8.25 for our existence. So they are supposed to level off, but that is all predicated on the investment strategies for PERS and STIRS retirement systems, their return on their investment, and the gap between their obligation and their unfunded liability. So it's a bit hard to say. What we have not seen, unless James, you may have heard something I haven't, we don't see anything in the next 3-year budget cycle from the governor that really addresses the increased rates. I thought we might see another temporary, at least, freeze, but I think they've moved away from that a little bit. I'm not sure why.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything, and it's not, I guess in a way to say it, it's not within the political appetite right now. I think before COVID, when there was, I guess, less to focus on, they did set aside some one-time money to assist districts with the STIRS and PERS rate to kind of freeze it at a certain level. But because of the pandemic and other pressing needs, the governor's appetite has been more focused on more programmatic needs, more COVID-related pressing requirements that he needed to push out for the districts. But currently, and what I've seen in regards to any projected budgets in the future, I haven't seen anything in regards to helping out with STIRS and PERS.
Yeah, it's and what's frustrating to me to see in the trends that I was looking at over this period was, the percentage of our budget, and not including this year because we haven't settled the contract, but in the last however many years I was looking at, the percentage of our budget that's going to our employees, meaning salary plus benefits, has remained fairly constant. But when you understand that a bigger percentage that is going to benefits, a smaller percentage is going to salaries, and while that total amount in terms of our budget, it's like, okay, we're doing right by our employees, but when it's funneled into retirement, which is important, that doesn't pay today's bills for people. So it's hard to feel like, okay, we're on track doing what we should be doing, devoting X percentage of the budget to our employees, but with the way the ratio that's going to salaries versus retirement and benefits, and when what's happening with inflation, it feels overwhelming. And I keep communicating this to our legislators when I meet with them, which is, they're probably annoyed with me. They probably hear from me far too often. But the problem that we're having it's a statewide problem, the teacher shortage, and we are not going to solve it unless we get a lot more money from the state so that we can pay folks decent wages to be in education professions. And that's across the board, not just our educators, but everybody, because we're short everywhere. And and some of them it takes some time before they really hear, like, no, this is the impact to our budget of what you're doing. And we need you to step up. And I was talking to one of our legislators about student teachers and about how they don't get paid. And those jobs, when you're student teaching, because I have a child who's student teaching right now, and I know what this is doing to them, you can't have an outside job. When you're taking classes yourself, you're student teaching, there is not enough time to have another job. So folks are going into debt as they're student teaching. And a legislator said, well, you could do that, or there are these grants. And I'm like, this is a statewide teacher shortage. It requires a statewide solution. And you all need to put more money into these programs that are going to attract and retain teachers. And part of that is paying our student teachers, and we need state help to do it. When we're trying to balance our budgets and try to not even keep up with inflation for our current employees who we're paying, adding a whole, trying to pay our student teachers, just, I don't know how that fits in our budget. We need the state to do it. So there are, and that, of course, that made sense to this person, and hopefully we'll have some movement there. But like any opportunity that we get to advocate for more money and to point out to our legislators the real impact on the ground for us, because sometimes I don't think that they realize what is happening at our level to our budgets when they make certain decisions and certain investments. So I just, I know I see some folks on the call, and I know some of you advocate and are in touch with legislators all the time. And we're going into the May revise. The budget is not set yet for next year. So we have a few short weeks to get more money for public education. And now is the time for us to be working that. And I hope we all do.
Thank you, Trustee Jones. Any other feedback from the group? Any other input? We've got about 8 or 9 more minutes before we break this meeting and everybody gets in line to buy tickets for the Board Budget Subcommittee meeting. Come on, don't laugh. I know people are selling them on the QT for big bucks. All right. Well, seeing none, I thank everybody for being in attendance. We will bring forward our information the best we have it at the next meeting. And I'm happy to provide an update on the advocacy that will be taking place at the state level and the progress we make in Washington. And I thank you for being here. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.